welcome to this episode of Frontrunner 2020. I'm Ron Turner.
So thinking about a homework piece, you've probably done this type of exercise before. I would start by asking, like, who's in your inner circle, right? That maybe it's your top 5 speed dials, maybe it's your your go-to let's go grab lunch on the fly list. And then I'd start thinking about who's in your expanded circle. So being conscious to think about who are those people whose company I enjoy, but maybe I only see them situationally, or who's in my circle that I only get to see, that I only intentionally see once or twice a year, but why? Is there do they have passions that we could explore? If we intentionally explore, it could be beneficial to both of us in our friendship. And then, of course, as Ron noted earlier, doing that check-in about who's missing here, right? How much of my circle looks and acts just like me, creating an echo chamber. That's not good for how you're when you're thinking about what are the needs of the community at large, and it's not going to be good when you're thinking about tackling really big new problems, because you're only going to be able to draw from essentially the same experience you already have. So who's missing? What type
John,
of people are missing?
Let me build on that, if I may, because it connects to something in episode 4 when Lillian Salerno gave a very motivational presentation urging women to run for office. One of our questions that emerged from the audience included the observation in campaigns where she found a lot of women working on campaigns, doing a lot of the work, but not so much in the leadership and management, and especially her point was in a case where her candidate won, that those women were not carried forward into the leadership positions in government. So that was a real-world example that reminded me what we ought to be doing in our own personal lives and development and campaigns.
If we're all doing it early, before we're in that really public arena, both we can learn our practice and then practice our learning. And I think that's just like from episode 4, that's a huge point. And we can just be intentional about the type of campaigns, the type of relationships, the type of life we want to lead. So the big drum roll is, wow, this really actually connects well to a campaign. I think you saw it going here. So if you're thinking about management and communications, sales and development, and your human resources, management, you as an organization, it's your plan. And then, of course, as a campaign, that would be your campaign plan. So tying all these things together and setting your vision and your goals. For communications, it's about your story. And once you've really figured out how to authentically tell your story, so the external and internal are on the same page, it becomes easy to build that into the campaign message. So both how you as a candidate are showing up to tackle the most important issues in a district. In terms of sales and development, this is about the value you bring to whatever you're working on. That's you as an organization. And of course then, it really connects directly to the campaign fundraising, because you've both developed a track record of, when I am asking you to join me in the work we're doing, you're going to get a quality experience. So when I'm asking you to join me in my campaign, our campaign, with a contribution, people know they're going to enjoy that user experience and they're getting a quality product. Finally, the human resources and membership, these are about your relationships. It's about you being intentional and building, nurturing and growing leadership, finding out how you're expanding your circle and figuring out who's missing to fill those gaps. And those are skills that both then translate directly into the volunteers you'll need to be successful, as well as the skills to find more volunteers in the campaign. And hopefully, by modeling that behavior for other people, you're going to actually set yourself up in your field team and everyone that's working on your behalf to model that authenticity and that intentionality in terms of relationships. Again, like, the logic model here is simple. You're an organization, you're a campaign. But when you add a layer of being strategic and thinking about how I'm going to be intentional about every one of those steps, I think it gets us a lot closer to success and wherever you're trying to get. So that's my 2 cents. I really appreciate you letting me share some of the thoughts on this. And Ron, thanks for inviting me tonight to help with the presentation.
Thank you very much, John. That was fantastic, and it strikes me among our episodes in this young series as the one with some very deep strategic thinking, which I appreciate and personally enjoy. And we've also brought it to some specific homework points as well. So at this point, we'd like to take questions from the audience. You may type them in your questions panel, and we will organize them and prioritize them. I'm going to start by asking a question myself. I first met John when he was working in South Dakota. And so, John, get into your time machine and think back to that year, because you all have to know that I didn't prep him that I was going to ask about that. But I was so impressed where in a Western state that when there were all of these anti-marriage initiatives going on, that he garnered national attention from almost winning. So I'm not sure I know exactly what question to begin with, but take it where you will. How does tonight's topic, how would your experience in South Dakota be an example of what you've taught us tonight? Let me ask it that way.
You made me really go into the Wayback Machine for that one. But I appreciate the question, and for people that sort of don't know, the story of the South Dakota campaign is interesting. It was a campaign that had theoretically no chance of winning. It was supposed to be a fool's errand, and sort of we were written off from the beginning. And the great thing is that when there's no pressure to succeed, it really opens up an environment of experimentation. So we were able to try new things in South Dakota. And I'm thinking about how I was just finishing up college. I moved back to do that campaign, and I'm thinking about, so what were the pieces of me as an organization that helped here? Well, the first is that there wasn't a large organization of LGBT people or doing work on that campaign. Before we got there. And, there were some really dedicated activists in South Dakota who are still doing amazing work. But a lot of what we ended up doing was figuring out, how do we empower people to be representatives of the campaign and go out in the world and do that? So I thought about, and I found myself doing a lot of the communication pieces. So I thought, specifically about setting my really short-term goals, those first time, and writing them down. Okay, we're going to need to go to peer first. We need to, I remember that first couple of weeks literally being like thinking about how do we get through the day, let alone through the year, which got better as we went. And, I had a chance to tell my story, and it was, as a South Dakotan, I got to figure out, how did I publicly speak about the things that I cared about and the places I came from, and how that affected this campaign. The good news is that we found places to showcase that, like a series of public debates, or some segments that are on the major local stations. In terms of sales, this is something that I got better at over time, and making my first set of asks to raise money, and that I had never raised significant money before, and I was underselling the value of both me and the people we were working with initially. and that's something I'm still kicking myself a little bit for. When you're within, it was about 12,000 votes of victory. A couple direct mail pieces could have put us over the top on that one. But the one thing that I think that I really applied, and it's become more intentional as I've grown from those experiences, is thinking about the relationships with people. And not only because in that first case, literally was recruiting them to be volunteers, but also because it showed me the value that the people you meet along the way can show up unexpectedly later in life. And so one thing I've tried to do since that campaign is really think about, how do I stay in contact with those people? How do I learn more about them? And it's a huge growth opportunity. So I think you can kind of work through the departments on that. But man, that campaign was something else. And the good news is, and the bad news is that I'm sure I'll never do another one like it.
Right. Take that how you may. And to the
Right.
idea of building relationships, that was how I met you. And, that led to us doing this program tonight together. And I think of that as a very positive example.
Absolutely. And I just think of all the people along the way that, I watch them out in the world doing great things now. And, the good news is when you're being intentional about what you want to do in the world, in those relationships you want to nurture, then you can track those over time. And now we've got our, like Ron and I or other people, we have a really deep well to draw from as we're moving forward.
Thank you, John.